Okay, thank you, Mathieu, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for joining. As Mathieu said, the title is going to be Multi-Decadal Intensification of Atlantic Tropical Instability Waves, and this has been published in a study very recently at the end of last year in GRL. So it's in collaboration with my advisors at AOML, Renatus Perez and Greg Falls, but also together with Peter Brandt from GEOMA in Germany, and also with Rick Lumpkin from AOML as well. And the basic motivation for this study is basically a few studies that came out very recently on the issue of, has the ocean been speeding up, and can we actually detect these kind of trends? So there has been a paper by Hu et al. In 2020. They looked into reanalysis data and found this deep reaching acceleration of the mean circulation over a time period of 2 decades. This, at least the deep reaching part of that acceleration trend, that has been questioned by a very fast response paper from Carl Wunsch, saying that there might be an intensification close to the surface, but at least not for sure, and with high uncertainty in the deeper part of the ocean. There's been also observational studies like this one from Brandt et al. In 2021, seeing that there's an observed intensification of parts of the equatorial currents, so in this case the equatorial undercurrent, where we see intensification of about 20% over a time period of 10 years. But however, this trend was mainly attributed to multi-decadal variability and not to global warming. And then most recently, this paper by Peng et al. From just last year, that is also picking up on the studies by Hu et al. And by Carl Wunsch, who took a look into model simulations and found this very pronounced acceleration of the upper ocean currents that is attributed to the surfing warming induced, or to surface warming, basically to global warming. So all these studies, they have in common that they either observe or predict or simulate an acceleration of the current systems. And we took this information and thought about what does it mean for, in our case, for tropical instability waves. And this is because when we are just looking at the equatorial circulation in the Atlantic on the surface, so this is now based on a drifter wind altimetry product from Lumpkin and Gazzoli, and just showing the zonal flow near the surface, long-term mean. So we do see in the central part, we do see these 3 currents, the main currents, which are the eastward flowing north equatorial countercurrent, and then these 2 branches of the south equatorial current, the northern one just north of the equator, and the central one just south of the equator. And we do see this region, especially between the NECC and the northern SEC, this region of strong meridional shear. And this is one of the regions where we have the generation of tropical instability waves, just due to the shear of the current. And so the question was, if these currents would be accelerating, there would also very likely be an increase of the shear terms. So not only the DUDY term, so the meridional shear of the background zonal flow, but also if you think about that the equatorial undercurrent is just below the SEC on the equator, we would also very likely increase the DUDZ term. And these 2 terms have a lot of saying in how strong tropical instability waves are generated. And this is why we were interested in seeing how these tropical instability waves behave over a longer time period, and if there are long-term trends. Just a short recap for those of you who might not be familiar with tropical instability waves. Shown here is just a loop of satellite sea surface temperatures from last year's summer. So it's a 90-day loop starting end of June and ending in end of September. In this SST pattern, we see basically the most obvious feature is the development of the equatorial cold tongue in boreal summer. So these starting now, this entrainment of or this propagation of colder, relatively cold waters into the central part of the Atlantic, just caused by the acceleration of the trade winds and intensified equatorial upwelling. This is also causing a very pronounced meridional SST gradient. So we have these strong pronounced fronts just north of the equator. And this is also the region where the SST signal is strongest due to tropical instability waves, so where the gradient is strongest. And you can see these wave-like features. I'm hearing some noise, but is that me or is it someone else? Yeah. Okay. Anyway, the cold temperatures, they are being advected from the equator northward, so there's some cooling north of the equator. But then on the other side of the wave-like features of the tropical instability waves, we have a warming of the equatorial regions. Tropical instability waves are not only obvious in SST, and I don't want to say they are basically observed in all parameters, but definitely in a lot of different parameters. So in physical parameters, such as sea level anomaly, sea surface salinity, of course, current velocities, but then also in biogeochemical tracers like oxygen, chlorophyll, and nitrate. On intraseasonal timescales, and when I'm talking about intraseasonal timescales, I mainly mean the range between 20 to 50 days, so roughly a bit shorter than monthly and almost 2 months. TIWs are the dominant signal in the central part of the Atlantic. So it's a really pronounced variability in all these parameters. One of the reasons why we care about tropical instability waves is because they have an important role, or they play an important role for these regional budgets of heat and freshwater. So on the one side, as I just showed you, there's advection by these instability waves, but there's also vertical mixing. And sometimes these effects are competing with each other, and then the net effect is still an ongoing research. Another thing that is interesting about instability waves is that the variability on the ocean feeds back onto the atmosphere. So it has also been shown that tropical instability waves are able to alter the atmospheric circulation close to the fronts that they work on. Another part that is also really interesting is that the tropical instability waves are able to excite free equatorial waves on the equator mostly, and these waves are then propagating downward as Yanai waves, or also called mixed cosmic gravity waves, and they are a very dominant or prominent feature of the deep ocean, and they also have been shown to be a mechanism to maintain the deep equatorial circulation, which is quite energetic. So that's also why, or that's one reason why tropical instability waves play a role. Just for the seasonality of tropical instability waves, they are, in the Atlantic at least, they have a pronounced seasonal cycle with maximum activity in boreal summer. So mainly from June to September, depending on the variable that we're looking at. However, there are also some years in which we observe tropical instability waves in the winter months, so mainly in December or January. But this is more on an irregular basis. Okay, so then we came up with our research questions that I also touched a bit upon. So first one is really basic. If you're seeing these, or if these studies were suggesting long-term trends in circulation acceleration, do we also observe some long-term trends in tropical instability wave activity? So we are addressing this question by first just identifying the mean patterns in space and in time of tropical instability wave induced variability for a few parameters. And then we're looking into how these patterns have changed over time, just also to exclude potential spatial or temporal shifts of variability. Then, so I can already say we do observe a long-term intensification, and it's also the title of the talk. So the next question is, of course, what is causing this increase in activity? From an observational perspective, it's not so easy to address it in a very comprehensive way. We cannot calculate a few of the generation mechanisms. So we had to focus on one, which is the barotropic energy conversion term, which is also, as I will show, an okay thing to do. And then we also provide an hypothesis of how wind stress variability might have played a role on these long-term intensification. And the last point that I will talk about is giving you one example of how tropical instability wave activity has impacted the central equatorial Atlantic. And this example will be on the eddy temperature advection on a horizontal view. Okay, just a few words to the data I'm using, just an overview. If we're just looking into the sort of the equatorial section of the upper equatorial ocean, so from the surface to 100 meters and from the western boundary to the eastern boundary. At the surface, we have satellite data from various satellite missions, so we're delivering us with or providing us with SST data, sea level anomaly data, and sea surface salinity, available since around 40, 30, and 10 years. Then we also use atmospheric parameters, so we're using the 10-meter wind speed from ERA 5. And then within the ocean, we are using the data, so horizontal velocity that is at an approximated depth of 15 meters, that is derived from this drifter wind altimetry, or provided by this drifter wind altimetry synthesis, also since the start of the altimetry in 1993. So all these products, they are provided at a daily basis and at a quarter-degree horizontal resolution. We also make use of one more data set that is giving us more or less a unique view on the subsurface ocean. So that's a velocity time series from a moored observatory on the equator at 23 West, where we have velocity measurements since 2001 with a few gaps, but also consecutive data of the upper ocean since 2008. So quite a long time series already, and just another independent source of data in the subsurface. Okay, and then the last slide before I will start with the results, just because I will be using this term tropical instability wave activity quite a lot, I think it would be useful to introduce it as well. So if you think about just the gridded variables that are available at either surface or at 50-meter depth, so just at one single layer, looking into P is here just a placeholder for any of these variables, and we have information, or these are provided as a function of longitude, latitude, and time. To isolate the tropical instability wave signal out of these time series, we apply a bandpass filter both in time and in the zonal direction. So in time, we isolate, or we filter for the intraseasonal range, so the 20 to 50 days. So we don't want to have any high frequency signals or low frequency signals. And in the zonal direction, we filter for the range between 4 to 20 degrees, just to isolate short waves or even basin scale features. And this is then denoted as a prime. So everything that is where you see a prime, this is filtered. So then we take this daily time series of filtered, of the filtered variable, and take 1 month of the data and calculate the standard deviation to get an estimate of the variability within this month. So yeah, just a sigma of the filtered variable. And now the T is not anymore daily, it's a monthly time series by now. And then we also did some averaging over seasons or months, and also within boxes, spatial boxes. And these are then denoted as overbars, or the subscript tells you which months have been used to generate this average. And then of course we lose the temporal dimension, and we end up with horizontal maps. And that's what I'm going to be starting with. So first, the trends, do we observe them? But first, looking into the mean patterns. So this is the mean variability pattern due to tropical instability waves in space and in time of SST in the top panel, sea level anomaly in the middle panel, and meridional velocity in the lower panel. What you can see in the SST is the most pronounced signal is just north of the equator, so that's the maximum at 1 north, where we also have the strongest meridional gradient of SST, so that fits quite well. In SLA, it's also north of the equator, but even further north, so it's around 5 north. There's no signal on the equator, which we also do not expect. So there are tropical instability waves on the equator, but these are associated with Yanai wave features, and these equatorial Yanai waves, they don't have a signal or a signature of sea level normally at the surface. So we also don't expect any signal in SLA. And at 5 north, it's more or less related to Rossby waves, and there we observe this interseasonal variability. It's also at 5 north where we have the most pronounced signal in meridional velocity at 15 meters. However, in this plot, we would also expect, just based on word observations, a secondary maximum on the equator. So it's already giving us a hint that this product might underestimate the variability on the equator. So we are a bit more careful when we're using this data set on the equator, but we are confident that it's doing a good job on north of the equator, but we also compared it to mood observations. Okay, and all these parameters, they have a seasonal cycle which is peaking in July or general June to August. So that's quite consistent in these 3 variables. Okay, then we also looked into sea surface salinity. Yeah, come up here. So sea surface salinity is a bit shorter time series, so it's only 10 or 11 years in this case. But nevertheless, we see still a very distinct signal north of the equator, very similar to the signal in SST. It's a bit shifted to 1 month earlier than the SST, from May to July, peaking in June, but that's also been observed in previous studies, so it's not a surprise. And then finally, we looked into the mode observations on the equator at 23 west, building an average, or like a current velocity, meridional current velocity average of 20 years. So we're using subsurface mooring and also data from the Pirata moored surface buoy at the equator at 23 west, which is this 10-meter value here, which agree quite well. But this is nice to see just how the vertical range or the vertical extent of the tropical instability wave signal reaches. So I cut it off here at 50 meters. I mean, you can also probably cut off at 70 meters or even deeper. It's not so clear where tropical instability waves have to be cut off, or at one point it becomes some free equatorial wave signal. But we can definitely see this peak in June, August, and September, July, August, September, and then also sort of a secondary peak in January over here. Okay, so this is the main situation for these parameters. Then we looked into the long-term trends of, first of all, of SST, SLA, and meridional velocity at 15 meters again. So shown here is in red, or everything red shows an intensification, and everything blue shows a decrease of activity in terms of tropical instability waves. The gray dots show significant trends, and these isolines and all these plots, they show one of the isolines of the mean variability pattern. So just to exclude any spatial shift of variability, and we can see, especially for basically everywhere, but especially nice, we can see it in SST that the increase of activity is very much in agreement with where we also have the variability in a mean or in a climatological sense. In SST, we see the strongest increase during July and August, where you have significant increases of activity. It's a bit less pronounced, or it's definitely less pronounced in SLA, for example. So we still see this increase of activity, which fits to the mean pattern. It's mostly pronounced in May, June, July, but you can see they are not significant, and they are subject to high variability or also high uncertainty, basically. And it's even more pronounced in the meridional velocity. So again, it's even showing some decrease, or more like a dipole structure, with increasing in the east and decreasing activity in the west. In May, June, July, we see this positive sign, but it's again high uncertainty and high variability. And this becomes a bit more clearer when we're looking into this time series of sort of like annual composites, where we're using the months indicated here with the strongest increase and the regions indicated here by these boxes. For SST, it's a nice consistent trend over this 40-year period. But I mean, there's some oscillation and there's some internal variability in there, but overall it's a nice trend. And the shorter the time series, probably the harder it is to get out these or to isolate the long-term trend. So we have, especially when you're looking into 2021, where we know we had a strong Atlantic Niño, this is one of the most pronounced outliers in these three plots over here, and especially pronounced in the meridional velocity component. So overall, we have an increase in all these variables. It's more than 40% for SST, about 26% for SLA, and just above 0.4% for meridional velocity. But when I started this study, I had not the data available for 2021 for, at least not for SLA and for the meridional velocity component. So I started out with nicer trends, which are shown here, just to point out the importance of these interannual climate modes that can affect these long-term trends, especially when the time series is not as long as, for example, this SST time series. So we would have much more trends if we would not include the last year, which of course we do, but it's just making the point how important these internal variations are for long-term trends. For sea-surface salinity, we can more or less see it as a side note over here because it's really just a 10-year period, and we're already having difficulties with 30-year time periods to get a nice trend. However, within this time period, we do see a nice trend in the Central Atlantic Ocean that fits also again very nicely with the mean pattern. Interestingly, the trend is positive in all months. So it's most pronounced in May, June, July. So that's also the seasonal peak where we have the strongest increases, but it's increasing everywhere or in all these all year round basically. And if you're also looking into the time series, it's a very pronounced trend. So it's that pronounced that we also think about if we are extrapolating this trend backwards, so just back in time, we would very fastly end up at a zero value, like in the end of the 90s, for example, which of course is not very realistic, having no variability at all. So it really shows that this short time series, or the shorter the time series, the more it is affected by interannual or decadal variability. So we have this nice trend and we show it, but it's not comparable to like a 40-year time series. And then finally, the trend for the subsurface velocity from the mooring data. So this is showing here on top the time series of meridional velocity average between 20 to 50 meters. It's showing the time series, the daily time series in gray, and then the smooth version in black, and then this activity index that I mentioned earlier. So that's the monthly time series of the standard deviation. I also added sort of a seasonal average of the activity in green for May, June, July, and in blue for July, August, September. So if you remember July, August, September, that's the season where we have the maximum at the subsurface. But it's really showing that it's more or less the June, July months where we have the strongest increase, at least during the time period from 2008 to 2020. So it seems like, at least in the subsurface, yes, we have an increase, but it looks like also temporal shifts to an earlier onset of tropical instability wave activity. So from peaking in August, we more or less see the strongest increase in July and June. Okay, so these are the trends. So in all parameters that we looked at, whether they are long or not, we see positive trends. And the longer the time series, the more pronounced the trends are. So next, of course, the natural question to ask is, what is causing the increase in this in tropical instability wave activity? It's good to take a step back maybe and look into the temporal mean, eddy kinetic energy budget to sort of filter out which terms can be used to look at for generating more activity or more eddy kinetic energy. Not going into too much detail, but I'm just mentioning which terms we will be looking at. So on the left side of the equation, these are just the advection terms. So they only redistribute eddy kinetic energy and not really act as a source. And on the right side, we have the dissipative terms as as sinks basically. So the more interesting terms are on the one side the eddy pressure flux term, or also sometimes called pressure work. So that's a term that is basically describing how waves or radiation of waves introduces some eddy kinetic energy, possibly, for example, through meridional propagation of Rossby waves. So this term is mostly overlooked, and there are only a few studies for the Pacific Ocean that show on the one side it's a small term compared to the other terms, but it's not insignificant. So it's we definitely cannot calculate it from observations, but it's definitely an interesting term to keep in mind. So we're going to focus on these energy conversion terms over here, which are on the one side the baroclinic energy conversion term and the barotropic energy conversion term. So baroclinic energy conversion basically means that potential energy is converted into eddy kinetic energy, and barotropic energy conversion means mean kinetic energy. So from the background flow is converted into these higher frequency fluctuations or eddy kinetic energy, basically. So we cannot calculate, again, unfortunately, the baroclinic energy conversion term from observations. So we don't have vertical velocity. That's something that is very hard to measure. And we don't have density fluctuations at the same at the same availability as models have. So what we can do is we can calculate the barotropic energy conversion term. So that's only requiring horizontal velocity fields, and these we have from the drifter product, at least on one single level. It's also maybe not the worst thing to do, looking at the barotropic energy conversion and ignoring, at least from observations, the baroclinic term, because there has been a model study from Tuchen et al. In 2008 who looked into these two energy conversion terms and made some comparisons between them. So here they show the barotropic energy conversion term as a function of season, basically. Blue means we have a transfer of the mean flow into the tropical instability waves, and red is the other way around. So the tropical instability waves, or the high frequency fluctuations, they lose energy to the mean flow. So I'm just going to use these plots here to point out two things. On the one side, there's a seasonal cycle, so it's pronounced in July and September. So we only care about for now, we only care about the blue shaded areas. So it's more intense in July, September, and also partly in October to December. And then we also can see that these are available at two bands, basically. So these bands are right in between the main currents at the surface that I mentioned before. So in between, for example, here, the NECC and the NSCC, we have this band of energy conversion at around 4 north, and another one on the equator. The baroclinic term, on the other side, is also having the same kind of seasonality, with more pronounced conversion of energy in July, September, October, December. But overall, it's at a weaker level, or at weaker amplitudes. And this becomes even more clearer if you're looking at an average of, or a zonal average, and looking into the vertical dimension as well. So what they did was they calculated an average between 30 to 10 west, and then just showed the barotropic and the baroclinic energy conversion term as a function of latitude from 5 south to 5 north, and from the surface to about 250 meters. On top, they also show just the mean section of zonal velocity. So again, the surface currents that we already talked about a bit, and what's new now is the the extent, or just seeing the extent of the equatorial undercurrent, which is a very, very pronounced feature in the Atlantic, or in the equatorial Atlantic. So you can see just by R, you can see that the barotropic energy conversion term is much higher than the baroclinic term. And you can also see that the barotropic energy conversion term is right in between these branches again, so between the NSCC and the EOC, also at subsurface level, and then in between the NSCC and the NECC. So you have these two bands due to barotropic energy conversion, and due to baroclinic energy conversion, that's basically only happening between the EOC and the NSCC, where you also have a vertical share of the currents, right? So I mentioned that we cannot rely really on the drifter product close to the equator, but we can definitely use it to calculate the conversion term north of the equator to at least get this north equatorial band of energy conversion. And that's exactly what we did. So we calculated the term based on the drifter data, and this is shown here now for June, July, where the maximum of barotropic energy conversion is observed. And yeah, you can see it's only showing the band at around 4 north. The secondary band that I just mentioned before is not obvious, so we are a bit more cautious about our results close to the equator. But we can definitely use it to look into trends and further analysis at around or north of the equator. Okay, so we looked into the trend of the barotropic energy conversion term, and it shows that it's definitely increasing, significantly increasing by in May to June. Yeah, so May to June. So and if you remember, I motivated this whole study by thinking about how the equatorial currents might have been accelerated, and this would show up in the DU/dy term, and we have more meridional share, more energy conversion. So we can actually do this. We can compare the impact of this eddy term, the U prime V prime term, and the meridional share by just calculating the trend and keeping one of the terms constant. So this is shown here in black. It's the overall trend of the energy conversion term, and then in red it's showing you the same trend, but by keeping the meridional share constant. So it's really only the eddy term that is contributing to the overall trend. And this has been kind of surprising for us, or at least not expected, right? So we're still, I mean, it's part of ongoing discussion, I would say. So we have a few hypotheses for this. One would be that if you're thinking about the equatorial currents and assuming they are like almost very close to instability or close to marginal instability, so any acceleration of the current that would directly more or less supply instability and would not be measured as an increase in the meridional share, but rather directly measured as increase in velocity fluctuations. So that could be one of the reasons. So it's just not measurable, at least. We also thought about the possibility of wind stress variability in enforcing these high frequency velocity fluctuations. There has been a study, or it's basically the same study by von Schuckmann et al. In 2008, who were using different wind forcings to drive their model simulations. So on one side, they used a daily wind stress forcing, and on the other side, they used a more climatological forcing. And what they see is that when they're using the daily wind stress forcing, they end up with much higher levels of intraseasonal variability. So already pointing to the possible role of high frequency wind stress variability in driving these intraseasonal fluctuations. So we just took a look at the wind stress variability and the changes over time, and shown here because it's most pronounced in the meridional direction. This is shown over here. So again, red colors indicate that we have an increase of meridional wind stress variability, which is basically broadly distributed over the whole tropical Atlantic. And in this region, so that's the more or less the main region of tropical instability wave activity, we do see a significant increase of meridional wind stress variability basically from May to September. So there's definitely some elevated energy input by this high frequency wind stress variability. So that's interesting to see, but it's really just one hypothesis at the moment from our side, and we would need to run model experiments or dedicated model simulations to look more into that, which would be a really interesting thing to do. Okay, and then finally coming to the few last slides of my talk, I want to provide one example of how this increase in tropical instability wave activity has impacted the tropical or the equatorial Atlantic. And this is going to be on the eddy temperature advection. So I mentioned in the beginning when I showed the satellites images from sea surface temperature that tropical instability waves, the pattern they induce in terms of temperature advection is that they are warming the equatorial regions, so indicated here by red colors, and they're cooling the regions north of the equator. So this is just showing you here the horizontal temperature advection and just using the high frequency or the intraseasonal velocity data. So this is also why it's called horizontal eddy temperature advection term. Also shown here is in these squares the same advection term, but just based on mood velocity instead of taking the drifter data. So it's definitely stronger, especially stronger from observations on the equator, but the sign and the pattern that fits quite well with the drifter data. Okay, so that's the mean pattern, and then we looked into the trends, and we see that this mean pattern has basically been increased by 74 or as much as 74% north of the equator. It's also been increased close to the equator, but even more. But again, this is also the region where we don't really trust the velocities too much. So it's a bit more of a side note at this point, but definitely the pattern has been increasing by a lot north of the equator. But it's also part of the truth that this horizontal advection term is only one part of the overall SST or mixed layer heat budget, right? So it's definitely competing with the mixing term. So we would also expect more mixing, or more vertical mixing by tropical instability waves in case they have increased activity. So it's a bit of the question, what is the net effect of this overall intensification? Which term, the advection term or the mixing term, which is the more dominant one? Is there one stronger than the other one? So that's not really easy to answer from observations. Okay, and this already brings me to a few conclusions. So the first one, that's also very much the title of the study. We do see intensified activity of tropical instability waves in all these parameters that we looked at, especially over the last 40 years in SST, which is the most pronounced signal. And in contrast to our initial motivation, this intensification is not caused by acceleration of surface currents, so not caused by this increase in meridional shear, but it seems like it's been caused by high frequency current velocity variability. And then one impact that I just talked about one slide ago is that the horizontal temperature eddy advection pattern, so this cooling of north equatorial waters, that has also increased by more than 70 years in this 30-year time period. And I don't want to end with 3 conclusions, but I want to end with even more open questions that came up during the study or during the writing and review process. First one is the role of the baroclinic energy conversion term. So we couldn't look into this based on observations, so it would be really cool to look into that based on ocean models, see if there's a trend in this term on these long-term or these long time scales. Then what I also very briefly mentioned is that from satellite observations, we only look into the surface signature of tropical instability waves. There's only the mooring data, which gives us some insight into the subsurface, but it's in general a very strong baroclinic system in the equator. So the current situation at the surface is very different from the currents at thermocline level, for example. So there's different shear patterns and different instabilities. So it's really the question how coherent these trends are compared when we're comparing the surface and the subsurface level. I mentioned the possibility of wind stress as one driver of tropical instability wave variability. We are just hypothesizing at this moment, but it would be cool to have model studies focusing on different forcings and looking into the response of tropical instability wave activity. Yeah, one big question for me definitely is still what is the net effect of both intensifying TIWs, but also of mean TIWs for these different budgets of SST, also mixed layer heat budget, freshwater budget, and so on. So that's still not very clear. And then maybe an obvious question is, now that we are seeing this multi-decadal intensification, we can ask the question whether this is part of some multi-decadal oscillation, or maybe already a signature of or an imprint of global warming. So this is also something we can either only address with high resolution model predictions, or we have to wait until our observations are long enough to answer or to address this question. Okay, and with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, comments, suggestions, feel free to ask them now, or just leave me an email and I can get back to you. Okay, thank you.